This is We Bleed Orange and Black, the podcast for Halloween and horror lovers. Join us as we interview creators, discuss our favorite horrors, and share original spooky stories. I'm Jeff C. Carter.
I'm Ryan Gerasi.
And this week, we're talking with Chelsea Sutton about horror fiction, from the page to the stage, and everywhere in between. Chelsea Sutton is a playwright, fiction writer, director, and immersive experience creator for weird, fantastical dystopias with a sense of humor. Some of her many short stories can be found in Uncanny and Apex Magazine and Flash Fiction Online. She's the Associate Artistic Director of Rogue Artists Ensemble and the co-founder and co-director of the Rogue Lab New Play Incubator. Welcome to the show, Chelsea.
I'm really happy to be here.
So here's an icebreaker question.
Oh, God.
Is it theater if it doesn't draw blood?
No, absolutely not. I once had somebody walk out of a play of mine and say to the box office that they were leaving because they didn't come to the theater to feel things. And I still think that's the best review I've ever gotten. So, yes, theater should make you bleed.
Yeah, what did you come to the theater for?
I have no idea.
Just air
To catch
conditioning?
some Z's? Yeah.
Just to be in a dark room? When was the last time theater drew blood from you, Chelsea? Literally.
Oh, yes, where I met you.
Yeah. Uh-oh. That sounds bad.
Yes. I mean, no. The very last project that literally drew blood from me was Carousel of Fools, which was a pop-up immersive party theater thing that I did with Rogue Artists Ensemble, which is my home theater company. We took over the Santa Monica Pier Carousel for a night and made an odd, fun little carnival. And it almost killed me, certainly, as a creator and a producer. We have a lot of stuff. You guys have both seen our work, and we certainly are not minimalists. So I was one of many people who unloaded and loaded a U-Haul over 4 days, like 4 times. I was in our storage unit for like 9 hours by myself, just pulling things, and I absolutely ripped the nail off my finger.
Ooh.
So,
That's horror gold right there,
Yeah.
audience.
Yeah. And I'm pretty sure when you both approached me at the party, I was like sweaty and had that far off look in my eye of I have not slept in days. And what's happening?
Yeah, that's what identified you as a kindred spirit, because we were also very sweaty at the time.
Yeah, but you were there having fun.
That's
it was
true.
fun sweaty.
Yeah, it was fun
I was
sweaty.
there like, I've not eaten in 12 hours kind of sweaty.
Before we get into your litany of creative pursuits, can you tell us a bit about where you grew up?
I grew up in Southern California. I'm a California native. I was born in Anaheim and grew up in the outskirts of Riverside and Harupa Valley. And then in like Marietta, Temecula area. So Inland Empire. Went to school in Santa Barbara and ended up in LA, where I still am.
Nice. What got you into horror?
Honestly, I think my father, maybe I can blame a little bit. He got me into, this is more science fiction, but Ursula Le Guin and those kinds of writers early on. But I was the girl reading Goosebumps constantly, scary stories to tell in the dark. I often say that my aesthetic can be explained by a childhood of Goosebumps and Little House on the Prairie. Throw those together. Yeah, I think I was always drawn to spooky stories.
As a fan of spooky stories, when you started your own creative career, were you writing stories? Were you writing plays? What came first?
What came first was definitely fiction. I think my very first story I wrote in kindergarten was about like 2 dinosaurs falling in love. You cannot understand it because I spell everything wrong, which is still true to this day, that I don't spell anything correctly. But I think I won my first writing contest in 8th grade, which was a combination of, I was just stealing from the X-Files and Sphere, if you remember that movie.
Hell yeah.
And I think that was just my aesthetic from then on. I was a dancer when I was little, but I didn't get into theater until high school. And I started as an actor, which is mostly where a lot of people start. I wrote my first play when I went to the California State Summer School for the Arts, CSA, which is at Cal Arts in the summer for high school kids. And that was my first one act, but I still was like, I'm in the fiction track. And I went to UC Santa Barbara for fiction. But Naomi Izuka happened to be teaching in the theater department when I was there, and she really liked non-drama majors. So I took a lot of drama playwriting classes with her. That's how theater started to take over my life.
It really did.
Yeah.
So Chelsea, you are the Associate Artistic Director of the Rogue Artists Ensemble. How did you get involved with them? Walk us through it.
Well, in 2010, 2010 or 2011, they did a production called Gogol Project. It was an adaptation of several Gogol stories. There's a story he wrote about somebody's nose jumping off their face and having a whole life on its own. So there is a giant human-shaped nose that was in the show. These huge puppets, music. It was just this like, oh, this is the kind of work I want to do. This is spectacle, but it's spectacle with meaning. Mm-hmm. It's not just having big puppets because you can. Like there's a reason behind all these things. So I became a fan, and at the time I was doing marketing at the Falcon Theater, which is now the Gary Marshall Theater in Burbank. So I had this skill of marketing for theater, and they were looking for a marketing manager at the time. So in 2012, I joined just as staff and kind of hung around and got to know all these artists. And then in 2015, there was this Pinocchio adaptation they've been trying to do for, I think, 9 years up until that point. We do not have very quick development projects. I'll say that right now. We take way too long. We're not efficient as a company. But they were looking for a new writer to kind of take it over. And they had, at that point, gotten to know my work and gotten to know me and asked me, hey, can you take this on? And I said, yes, this is a dream project. Obviously, I want to do a steampunk Pinocchio. Duh. So I took it on, and I think I wrote that script in 9 months because it opened. I started working on it in January of 2015, and it was open by October, and it was very intense.
What is the Rogue Artist's mission for people who are not familiar with their work?
Rogue does what we like to call hyper theater, which is a combination of new technologies and ancient storytelling techniques, and we kind of shove them together. So we do a lot of puppetry, we do a lot of mask work, we also do a lot of video work, and we had an LED costume in one show. We do projections. We are always kind of pushing that envelope. We do kind of very design forward kind of work. So even the New Works incubator that I started with Lisa during several years ago, the mission behind that was to get writers and designers talking really early in the process, because so often writers are alone in their heads writing these things for the stage, and especially if they want to write something for a puppet or have lighting be a really important aspect and even character in a play, they don't necessarily know how to go about writing that on the page. So getting those conversations started early rather than 3 weeks before opening is really helpful, just to get more collaboration. And in recent years, we've really tried to toggle towards stories that are very LA based. And sometimes that's been history focused. And sometimes that's just making sure that we are trying to reflect the diversity of LA and the stories of Los Angeles. So we always kind of keep an eye on that too.
And I saw that with the Carousel of Fools, there is a expanded mission statement to bring in artists and creators from differently abled backgrounds.
Yeah, some of the Carousel of Fools came from this project that will be premiering next year called Schlitzie, Alive and Inside the Decaying Sideshow, which is going to be an immersive piece that I can't say where yet, but we're very close to get the contract signed. But it's going to be an immersive piece that takes you through the history of the sideshow, through the point of view of a real person who lived named Schlitzie, who, if you've ever seen the movie Freaks, like 1930s, 40s, he is featured prominently in that and was a very positive force in the sideshow community. But that community also had a lot of artists who, especially at that time, couldn't get work anywhere else. There were a lot of disabled artists involved in that. And we want, as part of like the mission of telling stories with people who the stories are about, represented in the cast and in the design team. That's where that's coming from. So Carousel of Fools was a fundraiser and a pop-up event, etc. But we tried to bring in some folks who have been on the team for Schlitzie as we've been developing it. And some of them will be involved in that show when it premieres.
Awesome.
It was a great location for it, just because, first and foremost, the carousel is such a loaded symbol. That particular one, because it's so old, has such a history, and just because of what's in our pop culture, Something Wicked This Way Comes and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
It was primo. So do you think that you have... It must be hard to find something for the actual show that has like that much
resonance?
Yeah.
I'm calling it now. Old LA Zoo.
Oh, I'd love to do something in the old LA Zoo.
We did.
You did?
Ryan and I attended the first LA Haunted Hayride up in Malibu. It was on the Biggest
Okay.
Loser Ranch.
Yeah.
And then it moved to Griffith Park. The hayride used to take you through the old haunted LA Zoo. So incredible. And then Mark Cuban bought 13th Floor Entertainment.
Yeah.
And every year it got worse.
Yes.
It got more expensive.
Mm-hmm.
How do you keep a space that is big enough for a long enough time that doesn't cost an obscene amount of money? How do you make theater accessible to people? I'm sure these are all issues that you guys are constantly battling.
Oh no, you've touched on the main problem of theater, especially in LA, but I think kind of everywhere right now. There's a lot of problems we have, but that's a big one. Especially the accessibility part of it is that you can kind of offset some of these costs with higher ticket prices, but ultimately, even when you go to a show that's like $130, that is touching so little of what a show actually costs. But because tickets are so high priced, it makes theater seem so elitist. Like that's the Broadway problem right now, right? And theater is of the people. It has always been a thing that is supposed to talk to power, to fight back and rebel, and to talk about the things that we need to talk about in our society. But if only people who can afford $200 tickets can come, then what are we doing? And then that also affects the kinds of shows that are chosen, because the people who can afford $200 tickets want to see a certain kind of show. And then we get Broadway, and then we get movies to musicals, whatever, fine. But yeah, LA, especially in this like coming out of post-pandemic kind of world, rental costs have gotten so much higher. So many spaces have closed in the last few years. And so therefore the spaces that do still exist are more in demand. And we're an itinerant company, so we don't have our own space. So just finding rehearsal space is like its own thing. So for the next two shows that we have, we're going to be premiering a show later this year and another one next year. They are in partnership with other organizations. Partnerships are sort of the way to go, at least for us right now, since we're smaller. And because our productions especially so much more money, because we have full design teams and usually bigger casts. And we, with the AB5 law, especially in California, this is a very California specific thing, that law was made basically to get Uber drivers money, but it has really actually affected theater in a huge way.
How so?
There used to be equity contracts where actors, stage managers could just get a stipend. But now the California law is that you have to show up for a certain time. You have to be paid hourly, and you have to be paid at least minimum wage. All these things are great. This is part of our values. I love that people are actually getting some money and they have to show up to rehearsal. However, it has ballooned small theater budgets to the extreme. And there was not a whole lot of transitional period between when the law went into place. So all these small theaters had to suddenly, who were working on maybe $20,000 budgets, have to do $80,000 budgets or beyond. It can't not affect the kind of theater people are allowed to do, and also just new play development, because a reading and stuff costs like triple what it cost before.
Oh, wow. Not just pizza and natty lights.
Exactly.
Speaking of partnerships, site-specific performances, and California history, can you bring us into the world of Senior Plumber's Final Fiesta?
Sure. I was so surprised when you both mentioned Senior Plumber as like the thing you loved so much.
Why?
The greatest thing that has ever happened? What are you talking about?
I have my
Oh my God, there it is.
program right here.
And I got him the book for his birthday.
Well, it was a weird little project because we did it during the Halloween season, first of all, and it was not a Halloween show, and it was immersive, but the immersive community in LA tends to be, going back to this ticket price thing, they tend to think that the more expensive a show is, the better it's going to be. And we always try with our shows to have varying ticket levels so that varying kinds of people with income can come. So I think our highest price ticket was maybe $50. And there was a slew of people who were like, well, it's probably not very good. We're not going to go because it was quote unquote cheap. Like we did a sign up sheet for community members to like say, I can't afford any ticket, so I want to get into a lottery. So we gave away a lot of free tickets and stuff. So yeah, it just surprised me. I guess that there's so much love for it.
I mean, it was the most immersive show we had done to that point, and probably since.
Yeah, I mean, we were really part of the family, part of that party
Yeah.
the whole time.
Can you summarize the origin of the project and then what it looked like in its final form?
Of course. So there's this very fun book called Senor Plummer, The Life and Laughter of an Old Californian. That is basically an autobiography from Eugenio Plummer, who was an old Californian who the Plummer Park in West Hollywood is named after. He didn't write it, but it's basically interviews with him from an LA Times writer who I'm forgetting the name of at the moment. It's a weird book because half of it you're like, is that what happened? And the other part, it really feels like someone who lived through a huge historical moment of the time. So Andrew Campbell, who was the former West Hollywood arts director at the time, this was in 2016, I think, he approached Rogue because he was a fan and asked if he could commission us from the city to adapt this book. So we took the book, and the final form of it was basically a huge magical mind party where we start with the launch of this book and then we go back in time, and you can follow Eugenio at various stages of his life, and you kind of have control of where you want to go. But you get to see little scenes of all these moments that are adaptations from moments of the book.
So it was brought to you. That's like fascinating.
Yeah,
Also,
it was a commission.
According to this, the book is written by Don Juan. I don't know.
Oh, yes. That's right. Don Juan was not his real name.
It can't be. Although, wow, what a name.
This is a neat prism to view the Rogue process. This book already existed, and a partner brought it to you and said, here's the site, how will you make this immersive? And so you created an incredible puppet for Don Eugenio, and then you also split the timeline of Southern California over the last 150 years into taverns and cowboy stories and bandits and murders and music and dancing and costumes. How did you put that together? How long did it take?
First, we got like our playwrights together, which I was one of 3, because this felt like this is too big for one playwright to do, and also we want multiple voices. Tom Jacobson was involved, and he's a West Hollywood resident and a big history buff and well-known playwright. And Diana Burbano was the other writer, who is a Latinx writer and amazing. And then there was me. Part of our research at the very beginning was going to historians, including folks at the Leonis Adobe House in Calabasas. That family is mentioned in the book. We realized there's a whole lot of California and LA history that is just not really preserved. So finding things like that we could go to and try to walk the grounds and walk the house and see what it felt like was really important for the early process. But we are a very like magical realism sort of company, and I think the book was really great for us because it really dips into magical realism in a way, because it's so based on like a 90-year-old memory of what LA was. So we took kind of fantastical license, but also like if you read the stories and then compared the scenes, it's not that strange. It's not so much license that we were not very connected to the heart of the original stories he told.
How'd you come up with the land shark?
No. That was one of mine that I adapted. He calls him the land shark. He is a character in the book, and he runs around stealing land. And there was a whole thing in the book and in old California history about settlements and land grabbing. And you had to be on the land for a certain period of time before it was yours. And if you left, you kind of forfeited, and land sharks could show up and just like sit on your land and decide it's theirs. There's a lot about that. And Eugenio was a translator in the court. So he was sitting in court a whole lot, listening to a lot of these cases, especially with folks who didn't speak English at the time, who were trying to get land. He was in the middle of all that kind of war. So there is a guy, probably multiple guys in the book, that he just refers to as land sharks. So we made him a literal shark in a suit, and I wrote him a song. And there's also a whole story he tells about riding sharks when he's a kid, when he's like in Mexico as a child. Like we were talking about surfing. When we first came on, he went out into the ocean and supposedly rode sharks.
Hell yeah.
That was one of the stories where like, I don't know, Eugenio, is this what you did? Are you sure? So some of the land shark stuff I kind of folded into the writing of sharks.
It feels like that really informed the tone of the story. And I think that because you're allowed to do that sort of magical realism, you really drew us in, like as opposed to just it being like a dry historical biography. It's so engaging that like you become furious when the land gets grabbed, you become joyful when they have joy.
Oh yeah, I can't not write magical realism. I've tried. And that is just where my mind goes. There's also this whole story in it that I adapted that called Rare Old Bird. That was him talking about like 3 of his really closest friends. And he calls them old birds, and he kind of uses language that is bird-like. Obviously, they weren't real birds, but in my adaptation, I gave them feathers and I gave them this kind of heightened magical sense. And they all like planted feathers in a little garden as they like left. And, you know, in his story kind of died and passed away. He was remembering them. And their feathers grew into a flower. So using symbolism and that can explore like what that feeling is to remember your old friends and to remember them dying as well. It's a whole experience.
And you get to bring in all the rich history of fables when you, I guess it's the opposite of anthropomorphizing. It's animal morphizing. I'm sure that's a word. When you turn characters into animals, you get to borrow those archetypes and those fables.
Absolutely, yeah.
Speaking of animal characters, can you talk a bit about the Kaidan project, Walls Grow Thin?
Man, this was a busy year for Rogue. The year before, the Halloween season, right before Plumber, we did Kaidan Project Walls Grow Thin in a 6-story warehouse in my Koreatown-ish, right off the 10. And it was an adaptation of Japanese ghost stories with the kitsune fox kind of character at the heart of it. There were 4 main smaller ghost stories we adapted, and then kitsune was kind of a ghost story that threaded a lot of them together. It was our first true horror immersive piece that we had done. And it was the first immersive piece we had truly done. We were learning what immersive meant and how to write it and how to make it at the time. So it was a wild, wild ride.
Ryan, do you want to say the thing about the tickets?
Yeah, we were at Scare LA that year, 2017 or 2016, whatever it was. And Jeff won a free ticket to Kaidan.
Oh.
I wrote a 1-sentence horror story about Kuchisaka Onna.
Right.
That was how you got a free ticket.
So I couldn't go to that year.
Yeah, I went to Kaidan alone.
Oh, no.
And had a brilliant time and told me all about it. And then I really regretted not going. And then the very next year, we were at Scare LA again. We saw this terrifying yet endearing puppet from across the across the warehouse.
Oh,
and
yeah.
drew us like moths to the flame. And it was you guys. And it was, what are your favorite parts of LA? And then I won 2 free tickets. So then we got to go to that.
Amazing.
Yeah, it was pretty weird and incredible. And I was like so psyched. And then to digress even further, I got there super early to Plummer Park. And this guy came out from the indoor area and he looked across the garden at me, and I had my little scally cap on. And he was like, "Oh, you're here for the show for sure." He was on his way to get ice. And so I volunteered to help him get ice because, you know, the beers were all in like coolers and stuff in there. And we had this like really deep conversation about dreams versus reality and stuff. And I got to go in to help deliver the ice and get a little sneak peek at what I was going to see. And it just it put this really beautiful color on the evening to kick everything off. And that's our story of the tickets.
What you don't realize, Ryan, is that guy was an actor, and that whole thing Chelsea had written down. Yeah, it was all staged. From Scare LA until you got the ice, Chelsea wrote every word. That's immersive, baby.
Very few people got to have that experience.
Yeah,
experience.
She's on that Westworld tip.
Yeah, I forgot that I brought Senior Plumber Puppet to Scare LA. For those who are not familiar, he is a human-sized puppet that very much, if you're not looking close enough, looks like an old man who just looks like your grandpa hanging out. He and I have a very deep bond because I've brought him to various things. He has spent a lot of time in my car, strapped in, people thinking he's my grandpa. He sat at my dinner table for several months, I think, probably around Scare LA, because I needed to take him places. And my boyfriend would walk out and see this person sitting at the table and would get scared every time, even though we know he's a puppet. But there are a lot of people, I just had him sitting on the table at Scarlet and was puppeteering his head and hands. And so many people got frightened, and so many people came up to take pictures because they thought he looked like their grandpa.
Oh.
And I think that year I was on a panel there about immersive stuff, and I was the only woman and the only one with a giant puppet sitting on my lap. It's fun.
So back to Kaidan, you used the fox spirit myth as the through line, which was very smart because that's such a strong archetype in Japanese ghost stories. What did you layer on top of that from the modern world?
Some of this had to be created once we had the space. That's the thing with site responsive kind of theater. We had gone through other iterations of this. We did a workshop of it at the Japanese Gardens in Van Nuys. So we did like a whole outside version of this with a totally different frame story, which had a totally different tone because you're like hanging out in a beautiful garden and like running into ghosts. Not super scary. But when we got this building that was built in like the 1920s and had up until recently been a family storage building. Like there were old Fox memorabilia and stuff, like actual like stuff from the Fox network that had been stored, like Simpsons memorabilia and stuff in that building for years. Even as we were going through, we were on mostly the 5th and 6th story. We were doing demolition and opening up a lot of those spaces, but there were tags on doors that just said Fox. Felt very like, oh, this was meant to be. But you've been in the building, so it's creepy as all hell. And the only elevator in it is this huge
freight elevator,
which it does a whole lot of work for you for the town. And we made it a family storage that belonged to Kana, who is our lead character. She was a present day Japanese woman living in LA who had gotten obsessed with ghosts that she thought were in her building, and specifically this kitsune ghost who she thought was following her around since she was little. And so when you walk into the play, you were there as a friend trying to find Kana, who's been lost. All of her employees are there like, we don't know where she is. We think she's maybe in the building somewhere, but we need your help. And that's how the story starts.
Ryan and I were there the other week at the Nest for Hatch Escapes, and it was so interesting to see how much the building has changed since Kaidan.
We still have our storage unit in the big shack in the back.
Yeah, you're never leaving that place.
Is that where you hurt your hand?
Yes.
Oh, geez.
I knew that was your blood I smelled.
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah. If you stand there and smell real hard, you can tell my blood has been spilled many times.
Yeah, there's a trails of it going back and forth. That's theater, baby. So not only did you develop the story for a garden in Little Tokyo and a 6-story storage facility, you also developed it into an app. What was the process? How did that emerge? Was that just the zeitgeist? People were really excited about apps at the time?
You know, the app process is a mystery to me a little bit. Where the app idea really came from was from a pitch that my co-writer Lisa Dring had done about doing another chapter of Kaidan, but as an audio experience. And we wanted to do it as like something you walk around a local cemetery and listen. But because we are extra and can't just do minimalism, Sean, our artistic director, really pushed for it to be an app so that we could include some visual experience stuff. And I think he always wanted to do an app. So yeah, that's how that started. We haven't finished it yet. We have only done chapter 1, and there are 6 chapters that are written and kind of ready to go. But also part of that, we did a walking tour of Little Tokyo. So that's actually like a free part of the app. And we did interviews with local historians and people who know ghost stories of Little Tokyo, and we wove them together. So you can walk around that First Street area, like near Japanese American Museum, and there are all these little stops along the way, and you can hold up your phone and see AR animations at various points as well.
Something I heard you talking about on the No Proscenium podcast was the decision-making process. Like, okay, we have an idea. Why does this deserve to be immersive? Because you can write short stories, clearly, and you can write plays, you can write straight-up theater, and you can do immersive in apps with augmented reality. What are some of the questions you ask of a piece?
I think the most important thing, whether it's fiction or plays or whatever, is that the form and the content have to be in conversation with each other. The form should not be forced upon the content, just because you think it's neat. The content, the questions you're asking, the characters that you're exploring, and also how you want the audience to be implicated in the story or not, how you want the audience to be feeling, if it's important for them to feel uncomfortable or to make choices, or if you need them to be passive. Like all those things, even from a short story perspective, that informs what point of view that you write at. If you do a first person, if you do a third person, whatever. It's not even like the big forms, it's all the choices that drill down to it. You can't have those conversations separate, I suppose. So like with Schlitzie, it was always going to be an immersive show, which this is, we'll see how it ends up because we're still moving towards production for that. But it felt really important that story, the story we actually want to tell, which is not just recreating a 1930s sideshow, it is how do we get people to understand the humanity behind the sideshow and why it fell apart and what were the good things about it and what were the terrible things about it. The best thing for that story felt like we need to get them sitting next to people, sitting next to the artists and tying knots and doing laundry with them and whatever it's going to be, and feel actually a part of the family. And what is that experience? And is it uncomfortable for people? And how do we want them to feel about that? If you're just sitting in an audience watching a sideshow from 1930s, you are passive and you don't have to be thinking anything about how this affects your own life or how artists with disabilities work in the world today, how they were treated back then. You don't have to think about any of that because you are a passive perceiver of all of it. I mean, you can think about it, but not in the same way as you are going to be implicated in how the story is working when you're sitting there and have to respond to people talking to you or have to be part of just getting the sideshow to travel to the next town. We have to ask those questions, I think. So with Kaidan, I think we were definitely responding to this movement in horror that is all about visceral experience, which is like, I mean, I'm a haunted house girl. Like, I always want to go to the haunts and the mazes and stuff. What does it mean to not just have the scary, visceral jump scares, but to fold in actual narrative on top of that? And also fold in the implication question. So a lot of what Lisa and I, who are the writers for Kaidan, thought about were the feminist take on all these stories, because women in these old stories, man, they're not treated real great.
Yeah, being the second wife was not really a forgiving position.
A lot of them are also great revenge tales from angry women, and we loved it. One of the little pieces that I was like the head writer on was the one on the sixth story, which was the Oiwa's story adaptation, which ended up being basically a snuff film commercial. I made it like as you kind of journey through the story, we started really ancient and then got further into modern times. And so that little piece of the story, you were part of the film crew. Like we gave people lights and cameras and things to have to move. And you watch this director slowly kill this actress. And then she comes back and takes revenge and stuff. But you're implicated in that. You are recording her death and you're not doing anything. And people were like, I feel really uncomfortable. Like, well, good, yeah. That's the point. The point is you are cast in this role and have been asked to do things for an hour at this point. And nobody ever chooses to say, hey, maybe don't kill her. Hey, maybe I should turn the camera off or anything. Those are the kind of ideas we were exploring in those moments. And it's not as resonant if you are passive.
You have some new horror plays on the horizon, and I saw you describe one of them recently as the darkest play you've ever written.
Yes.
So how are those projects coming along?
Well, I just had a reading of a play called I'll Be Your Villain, which is the one I said was the darkest play I've ever written. I guess compared to Kaidan, maybe it's not, but I don't know, it was pretty dark. I've recently been coming around to what I want to call my style of writing, which I landed on Gothic Whimsy. So I really called this play a Gothic play and did some research on Gothic novels and did some homages to them in the play. But this really wanted to be a villain's origin story kind of play. And I specifically wanted to focus on women and how women are or are not allowed to be villainous, in what ways they can be terrible, and how we actually determine those things. I was having some conversations with friends about Iago from Othello, and a friend had played Othello as both a man and a woman. And as a man, it's like, well, we don't like what you're doing, but you're kind of cool, you're a swashbuckler or whatever. And as a woman, it was like, oh, you bitch, hate you automatically. And there's something so interesting about what we think of as acceptable femininity and how we perform it or not perform it, and what we like allow for like kind of cruel or brutal behavior. So all of the women in the play, there's like 7 of them, are terrible and are villainous in their own way. There's a high body count right now at the end of the play, I'll say that.
Body count high.
Yeah.
Good to know.
I was interested, at least with this play, with the line between an antagonist and a villain, and like, what is the line that pushes you over and makes it, a villain has done something that they can't be redeemed. And is that line the same for a man? I don't know. I want to just make everybody really bad and terrible and see what happens. I just wanted to explore like what that kind of dark comedy line is. My favorite horror stuff always has some comedy in it, because I feel like you have to have those moments of release in order to make the dark moments really settle in you.
Sticking with that line of thought, you have a book coming out, Only Animals. You said the true monster in a piece is never the obvious choice. Speak on that.
For a while in my fiction writing, my short fiction writing space, I was very preoccupied with this idea of what a monster is, and assuming a monster is supposed to look a certain way, and how usually the monsters that are scariest come out of nowhere, or you don't expect them to look the way they do. Very much like Guillermo del Toro movie Shape of Water. The monster in that is absolutely not the creature.
Right.
So a lot of the stories I was writing towards a collection around that theme, taking everything from like classic monsters like werewolves and vampires to much more subtle realism monsters' behavior, and flipping it to show the human monsters that exist underneath those things. A lot of the stories in Only Monsters, which it's a chapbook, it's mostly flash fiction or sudden fiction. So that usually means it's like under 1,500 words. A lot of them are dealing with that line between human and animal, taking it back to Plumber a little bit. The title story of Only Animals is about kind of a futuristic world in which grief and deep feelings and sad feelings are pushed down and punished if you show them. And there's this group of girls who collectively decide to start crying and screaming and showing their feelings, and they kind of slowly feel like they're turning into animals. Because during the story, a lot of their teachers are saying, like, only animals are that, like, raw. You don't want to be an animal. We're human. We're somehow elevated from these raw desires and raw feelings. And we do become monstrous when we disconnect ourselves from our feelings in that way.
Well, congratulations on that. That's coming out soon. And now that we've moved beyond theater, that we are post-theater, can you tell us a bit about Slipped Beyond?
During the pandemic, I started this little project called Spite and Malice, which I sort of made up this production company that is me called Slipped Beyond Stories. And I had connected with this group of folks through the Orchard Project. There's this group during the pandemic that got together and talked about, well, what makes theater? Does it need to be live? Do we need to all be in the same room? Or can theater look like something else? And so there's a group of us that started getting interested in plays like through the mail. So I wrote this sort of sci-fi piece called Spite and Malice that was actually in reaction to my grandmother dying of COVID during 2020 and going through her stuff. And I'm very interested in found objects and using the power of things to tell stories. So I wrote this little piece that you got a little packet in the mail that told like a prose story, but then you had to go to a website to listen to audio bits and pieces. And you had these cards that you had to play into the universe. Depending on the card, if you got a 4 of spades or something, you had to maybe go to a space that you hadn't been in for a year or so, or that meant something to you, and then throw the card into a trash can, or like think about a thing. It was less horror and more about meditation and like putting magic kind of into the world. And the idea was that you were giving these cards to this woman who's trying to find her lost grandmother. The underlying like sci-fi fantasy is that there is this ongoing card game called Spite and Malice, which is a real card game my grandmother and I played for years, that like kind of keeps the universe in balance. There's these magical people who are playing this game all the time, and when you lose a player, they have to be replaced. And our lead character has kind of gone rogue to try to find her grandmother and is like put the universe out of balance. So with the piece, you have these cards, you have to go out into the world to play, and then there's audio and there's some video and some interaction through email. And there's also a 1-800 number that I set up where you could leave voicemails and you could also learn about the game. So I was very interested in that moment of like, how do I put theater and prose together? How do I use stuff and physical objects to play in this world? And what can this kind of story look like? So I still don't know if it's a play or if it's a fiction piece or what it is, but I want to do like the next chapter.
Awesome. So I love to ask my guests about local monsters, lore, cryptid, things like that. Can you tell us about the Yule Guru?
Man, that is a deep cut. The Yule Guru is a cryptid that I made up. My friend Lori Meeker and I worked on this, what ended up being a 3-year-long project called Welcome to Meadowlark Falls. We had started it as an immersive piece that was supposed to be like a fun take on Hallmark Christmas movies, but make it immersive. And we did one in-person immersive thing at the Greenway Courts Theater, but in the lobby, because it's a very cozy little lobby. It was super fun, but then COVID happened. So we did, for the next 3 years, at-home versions of this. So you get like a book or a package or something and interact with different things. So this is where I technically have done film directing, because I did a whole lot of film and audio directing for this project in particular. But for the last version we did, we just keep exploring the lore of this made-up town. She's always been the writer on this. I've always been the director, but she asked me to come up with a cryptid that is like a Christmas cryptid, not super scary, but could be this magic creature in this world. And I came up with the Yule Guru. And I'm so proud of you for pronouncing it correctly, because I thought it was very clever when I came up with the name, but I really had to like teach our cast how to say it. But he lives outside in the forest of this made-up New England town where all the stories take place. And he lives on maple syrup, and his fur smells like cotton candy, and he makes Christmas wishes come true.
Fantastic.
You know, the good one.
Yeah, the least scary cryptid ever invented.
Yeah.
So Chelsea, where can our listeners find you online?
They can find me at my website, which is chelseasutton.com, or on Instagram, which is CR Sutton, or on Twitter, WTH Coffee Spoons.
Chelsea, thank you for hanging out and blowing our minds and telling us about immersive entertainment.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Please subscribe and follow. Links are in the show notes. You can find me at jeffccarter.com and hit the link to pick up my collection, We Bleed Orange and Black, 31 fun-sized tales for Halloween. And you can find Ryan on YouTube at his channel, 20th Century RG. Until next time, stay spooktacular.